Okay, hello everybody again, and welcome back to this series of impromptu interviews on here on Beyond Room 313. This week, I'm delighted and over the moon to have Dave Cullen, who you all know from Computing Forever. And the reason I'm having him here tonight is because I absolutely love Dave's cultural reviews in terms of movies, TV shows, and in particular his understanding of the depth of characters, the archetypal structure of them, I think is very strong. And he approached it I think, very fairly. He just doesn't knock them for the sake of them because they're new. And I'm really interested in his latest reviews of the Rings of Power because it is an abomination, but it's not completely an abomination. There probably was something good in there. So we're going to spend the next hour talking to Dave about this. And also there's a deep spiritual consequence, I believe, to this, because if they actually corrupt or take away their archetypes, they're basically messing with the foundations of our spiritual structure. Am I correct on that, Dave?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thanks very much for having me on. It's great to talk about this, and I was very excited about this. I do get asked to do interviews, and my schedule doesn't always permit, but to talk about this is something I am very passionate about, and it's just been a wonderful break from all the heavy politics stuff. But I do think that that's part of it because, as we know, I mean, this woke stuff and everything else that's been coming in has really kicked off in terms of Hollywood. I'd say, well, you could go back a very long time if you wanted to, but in particular, it's become more acute since about 2015. And especially since they launched, we could talk about all sorts of franchises that are compromised with this stuff now, but in particular, all the big ones, which when you talk about the spiritual aspect of it, you could certainly talk about the cultural aspect, which is that I've always said that these big franchises are not just pop culture froth. They are essentially institutions, much like when we saw all of this in the United States and the UK tearing down of historical monuments and statues. This sort of rewriting of history or the discarding of certain things of history, the focusing on negatives. Every country, every people has things they're not necessarily happy about in their past, but it's nevertheless part of their identity nonetheless. And by corrupting all of these institutions, including the most recent one now, unfortunately, Tolkien, it is, as you say, it is having an impact spiritually because it's meant to demoralize and it's meant to humiliate. And I really do think that if you're tearing down a statue of someone because I don't know, maybe they're now considered racist by today's standards, or they were a slave owner, or whatever the hell it might have been that the left likes to contrive. And you're doing the same thing to something like a Star Trek or a Star Wars or a Doctor Who. I mean, that's another one that's really gone way too far now as well. It's precisely the same thing, and I think it's all part of ultimately the same cultural revolution that we're being brought on. But these stories, many of them, like Tolkien especially, I think that's why there's been so much um, animosity directed towards the Rings of Power, because there's something far more so than the other franchises I've mentioned. That one, there's something deeply sacred about many of the themes to do with it, and so something deeply rooted in our identity, European identity in particular. And I'm not, and this is the good thing where I think we can both appreciate from our own unique perspectives that Tolkien was sensitive to both European Christianity or Christian Europe, but also a pagan Europe. These things were not. Um, he didn't. I don't think he saw a separation between the two. I think he had a respect for both. And so the stories of the Lord of the Rings are, I think, deeply moving, but also unifying.
Yeah.
And so, yeah,
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up because what Tolkien represented was a very ancient conduit that went through sort of like the Christian literature of the Middle Ages, Grail mysteries, so on, those kind of romances, and then went back into the pagan stories via, again, these narratives being written down. That conduit has now been broken. When I look at the Rings of Power, I don't see any continuation with that legacy. I see a purposeful, it's like a train on a track where you have a switch on a point and someone has pulled the lever and sent the train off into another direction. And it sent it off into a place that it was never intended to go. I find that the underlying tactic or weaponization is not only just the sort of like the current thing, as they say, but also the message, as the critical drinker would say, but also the superficiality. If you find that, I like the Galadriel character in the Rings of Power. It's like it's not even as corny enough to be a modern archetype or a modern remake of, say, a bad female superhero in Marvel. It's actually something new. She is the most spiritual character probably in that kind of fantasy genre of Western literature, and she's reduced to this kind of Laura Croft joke. I mean that's absolutely deliberate. There's no way that was accidental. No way.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an interesting one because I can't divorce myself from the political side of things. I think, geez, I could almost make a reference here to Joe Biden. Like they know that we know he's a joke, right? We know that this guy is senile, right? And it's precisely the same thing with Lord of the Rings. It's not just that it's woke. It's not just that these things are compromised by the current year politics, right? It's that it's also shit, right? It's also meant to demoralize and just upset you by being mediocre. Like if it was just that it was woke, but it was otherwise pretty good and there were strong characterizations and good acting, because we could get into how bad the acting is. If the scripts were strong otherwise, if the themes were still interesting, you could sort of wince a little bit at the overt sort of woke stuff, and you could sort of dance around it a little bit. As we have done in the past, you could say, yeah, okay, this and this, but it's still otherwise very good. No. It's just shit. Like it's just all so bad. And I think honestly, given because Lord of the Rings, right, it's highly stylized universe, right? And that's clear in the dialogue as well, which it has to be written at a particularly high level. And you're dealing with a mind like Tolkien, someone of that era. Like how many writers today would you entrust with the responsibility of writing to that level? Because that was literature, right? Whereas this was based in the Second Age, this Rings of Power is not based on any books. So it is, in a sense, fan fiction based upon the appendices of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, so
and based on
it's comedy. But I've actually laughed at certain scenes that were not meant to be funny, that were so Monty Python-esque. Do you remember that scene where the Numenorians land their ship and they turn around, face the ocean, and go, "The sea is all."
The sea is always right. And when you watch, so the guys, they just, I don't know, it's like they're going to do a haka to the ocean or something, right? And so he's standing there, says, "The sea is always right." And there's a bunch of guys behind him that repeat it. And one of the guys looks to one of the other guys and he's like, "The sea is always right." Really? What the? It's like, are we really saying this?
I know. It was like the depth of composition in that line. Like it was, you could actually see the intellectual level of the writers just in that one scene. I couldn't believe that when I was seeing it. Look, and then in the first episode as well, there was also the scene where she slays this ice troll, this huge troll, and then she does this weird kind of thing with the sword and spins it around and puts in its. It's like, is this satire? That's what I kept thinking. Is this a satire? But it's not. It's real. And, and even the way, I mean, is it money laundering? I was even thinking the way they have to have. Did you see those fan fiction interviews before it? Go, my girl Gladriel, go.
Yeah, mysteriously, and then all that content just sort of dried up. But it just there was actually another one. There was another great line from the character of Durin, who actually the actor himself. Now, some of them they did put in. Some of them acted their hearts out. Some of them less.
Sorry for them, actually.
Yeah, some of them were woefully miscast, like the lady who plays Galadriel. But there was one guy who plays a dwarf, and he plays like he's like the granddad, I think it is, of Durin. Like, or sorry, no, he's one of the great grandfathers of Durin, right? And he says to Elrond, the young Elrond, he says, a dog can bark at the moon, but he can't bring it down." What is that supposed to mean? It's like
the scene where Elrond meets the is on the dwarf or on the elevator, and it turns into like, you'd have like a bad American 80s sitcom, and you might have an interjection of a serious moment. Like, the joke stops and someone says, well, my dad died and I never heard from you. Well, they actually put that in where he says, you didn't come to my wedding, you didn't come to my child's christening. I'm like, what the fuck?
The best one was the guy who says, they're taking, elves are taking our trades, and it's like they're trying to insert this characterized. Right. It's like they're taking our jobs. They're trying to put in. Yeah, it was very South Parky, and they're trying to put in this the highly sort of satirized version of what they perceive to be like Trumpian politics, and having a sort of a Trumpian political character in there. But I wanted to actually bring something up that was mentioned in the first episode, which I've talked about before, and then it's followed up. It's picked up again in the last episode, it was very, very peculiar. And I detected something. Of course, I always watch these things when I'm sitting down to watch them. I know there's going to be something off about this. I'm just very cynical about Hollywood in general now, because it's just gone very dark. And the first scene when she's a young girl and her brother, you've probably seen me talk about this. Her older brother, who died fighting Sauron, sits her down under a tree and proceeds to give her this little life lesson, this little story about, right, this metaphor. And it's this incredibly contrived metaphor. I'm like, oh shit, the writing is really bad, because I suppose they're trying to sort of compare this to some wise words that would come from Gandalf or something, but that was really well written. But in this case, it's her brother talking about, do you know why a boat floats and a stone sinks, or something like this, right? And it's like, I think, I'm pretty sure an 8-year-old could say why, because its mass is distributed over a large, but instead he proceeds to talk about how the stone sees only downwards, but the boat has a secret. It's looking up into the sky, and all this sort of stuff. Now, as absolutely daft and eye-rolling as this metaphor was, and as they were smug about it, they were so stupid, but they were trying to sound smart, and that's what almost made it a meme, right? But I didn't really articulate myself very well in a recent video, because I talked about how at the end of that episode, he says to her, she asks him, so the lights reflected in the water can be just as bright as those in the sky? Again, just ridiculous writing. And she says, how do I know which lights to follow? Which basically is asking, how do I know right from wrong? How do I know good from evil? How do I know what to do in life? And instead of, like, we used to teach children about, universal stories and parables and cautionary tales and just principles. We used to teach kids immutable principles and facts, simple stories that they could comprehend, that would be good life lessons for, like, going out into the world.
It's very
But yeah, exactly, right. We used to do, we could tell them and communicate very quickly with them, but we obviously had to learn how to speak to a child. But this actually is quite sinister, because he's speaking to a child, and what he says to her is, sometimes you cannot know until you have touched the darkness. And what I said was, in my video, I said, he's actually telling this to a child, that you can't know what good and evil is until you've experienced evil.
Yes, I found that very weird as well. Very creepy.
Yeah.
It's almost like that hippie 60s generation thing of, like, do what you feel. And then if you don't like it, well, you've learned. And that's an extremely dangerous lesson in life.
Yeah, and I sort of regret using the word experienced, because as somebody because it's not quite precise. I think people understood what I was trying to say, but as someone corrected in the comments, they said, Dave, it's more that he actually wants her to embrace the evil, which is what I was trying to say. Because you can experience evil, right? You can learn about what evil is by experiencing it as a victim, for example. Like, you could say, I lived under a despot, I lived under authoritarianism, I lived under the Iron Curtain, I've seen the brutality, I've seen evil with my own eyes. No, but you didn't partake in it. What he's saying is, imagine modern writing transposed Star Wars, this sort of writing. Imagine Obi-Wan Kenobi or Yoda sits Luke Skywalker down and says, instead of saying, because they were always telling him, be mindful of your feelings, be mindful of your emotions, you know, control yourself, control your rage, because that will betray you, because that's the path to the dark side, right? And you want to avoid the dark side, right? That's the whole thing, right? But instead, it would be like, if we took this metaphor and applied it to Star Wars, it'd be like Yoda or Obi-Wan saying, yeah, listen, Luke, the only way to know about the Jedi and to know about the Force is to go and join the dark side and be with Darth Vader.
Yeah. Very infantile. I find it all very childlike. Rather than teaching someone to have a contemplation of existence and their future life ahead or their life even now, it's not done in any kind of way that would cause pause for actual contemplation or looking at it in a way that's beyond the superficial. You compare that stone and the rock scene, whatever, to Elrond in the Peter Jackson trilogy, just talking to Arwen about what would happen to her when her mortal husband Aragorn dies, and she being immortal. I mean, that's how it's done. That's the template. They already had it, but they completely again went off track on it. You said something that's really brilliant in another one. You said, I remember in one of the video reviews, you said that Tolkien was in World War One. He had the ultimate life experience. He had survived it, and so on. And you had like Rod Serling, who did the original Twilight Zone TV show. I believe he was a Holocaust survivor or something like that. Now these guys had an aspect of their personality that was born out of actual the shadow being a very real thing to them. I don't know how anyone who's grown up in Hollywood with this kind of superficial lifestyle and outlook in life could ever possibly bring that to a story, to a TV show, to a movie. And I actually believe that's deliberate. I really do. They don't want anyone of substance involved. They want airheads because they want to make everyone an airhead, because it's a kind of a homogeny of intellectualism. Make everyone stupid, and we can sell them the same product over and over again.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's a very good point. It is very much the hard times create strong men, right? And so you had guys like Tolkien and people like that who were able to really write, and even the original writers of Star Trek 20 years earlier had fought in the war.
Yeah.
Or, you know, there was guys like
Scotty James McDoon was covered in bullet holes from being in the Canadian military. He was an Operation Market Guard. He was covered in bullet holes. He had missing a finger from being shot off by the SS. And look what you have now, you know.
Yeah, so this is the thing, and now we're into the good times create weak men part, and they're creating very, very weak stories where there's no. This is another very important thing, I think. There's no strong role models, and you look at for men or for women, and especially in the last few years, we've had lots of strong, like tough action chicks and that sort of stuff, and female superheroes and female action stars. And, you know, throughout the 90s and the 2000s, there's been other examples. I remember I actually did a video where I listed off, and I'll have to find it, like about 40 odd movies prior to Captain Marvel, because they were trying to make out Captain Marvel, which came out in 2019 before Endgame. So we're slightly moved on to another franchise here, but I'll get back to Tolkien in a second. But they tried to make it out as if, wow, this is such a glass ceiling shattering movie because look at this tough action hero. And they've made, whether it's Rey in Star Wars, whether it's Galadriel in Rings of Power, whether it's Michael Burnham in Star Trek, whether it's the new Doctor Who, whoever, the female Doctor Who, they've placed these female characters there, but none of them have any female qualities. And people say, well, they're just basically men, but with female. They're not even men. They're completely shallow artifices of there's nothing behind them. All these stories are written as if by an AI that is, you know, you can get these AIs that design modern art, right? They produce works of art, and most of them are hideous and totally soulless, right? There's something inherently creepy about the idea of a machine producing art, I personally believe. I'm not saying to use a machine to create art like Photoshop or something. That's a little bit different, right? But the idea that this thing because all it's ever going to do is create an extrapolation of what it thinks it should be. There's going to be no soul or heart or sentiment behind it. And so it's not going to move you or inspire you. It's just going to be empty. And I feel as if to a certain extent, there is a a template that all of these stories are following, because it's just not a coincidence that they're producing these empty, vacuous, shallow Mary Sues, and then all the men in the story are morons, or they're arrogant, or they're sexist, or they're whatever, right? And so you're right. I mean, we are on a train here, and it doesn't seem that there's any brakes on this bloody thing at the present time.
And there's also a strong sort of Orwellian memory hole as element to it. It seems that every new TV show that comes out, they say, or movie like this, they say it's going to break the glass ceiling for women, as if women have it's not happened before. It's going to break the glass ceiling for people of color. Star Trek is a half a century old. These issues were dealt with on the bridge of the Enterprise 50 years ago. There was absolutely, you had Uhura, you had Chekhov, you had Sulu, you had numerous characters that were of what today we call minority groups that were brought into that, and they were all there in the best possible way. They were there because they were professionals in the military, in the Federation, in space. You even had like the classics, a wizard like Spock, although he was a Vulcan and everything was logic and reason. He was almost like this wizard, druid, Gandalf type character who used technology. So everything was taken care of 50 years ago. And here we are, half a century later, and the movie will come out next week that'll have a woman in a role or a people of color in a role, and they will do the same thing, and they will act as if this has never happened before. And it's like there's a memory hole thing going on deliberately.
Yeah, well, you could go more recently. In the 90s, we had Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which had Avery Brooks as the first black captain, and he's my favorite captain. And this is the funny thing, Thomas. Like, we were watching these shows, we were watching like Janeway on Voyager, and these were great shows by today's standards, and never once, did I think when Janeway or B'Elanna Torres were having a conversation about the warp core or whatever, never once did I go, well, here's two female characters who were talking about technology. At least this scene is passing the Bechdel test. And never did I think this. Never did it cross my mind to make a big deal about the fact that this was a female character. And they were just brilliant characters by themselves without having to grind down the men. And likewise, you've actually made me think about Avery Brooks, who played Captain Sisko in DS9. There's a scene in the 7th season. The episode is called Bada Bing Bada Bang, and it takes place in the holodeck with the character of Vic Fontaine, he's a Las Vegas sort of Sinatra-esque crooner in this holographic lounge, and his girlfriend, who's also black, she wants him to spend some time there in the holodeck, and he says, "Listen, do you know why I don't want to go to this holodeck? Is because it's 1962 and it wasn't an easy time for our people. And if I go in there, you could be a performer, you could be a busboy, you could shine shoes, but you could never be a customer in the casino." And she proceeds to say to him, and he says, "I'm not going to pretend that it was an easy time for our people." And she says, "Yeah, but it's not like that in VIX. It's a holodeck. And, it's not real." And he says, "But that's the lie. That's the lie. That's why I won't go in, because it's not real. And it should be." She says, No. The only restrictions that we place upon ourselves, the only restrictions that are there in the holodeck are the ones that we place upon ourselves. This is the way things should have been, the way they could have been. And that's what inspires him. And that message would never be allowed on the television now.
No, because it's almost like that Joseph Campbell's hero's journey thing that was derived from that, which was actually, we know a lot of George Lucas actually had Joseph Campbell as a consultant on the Star Wars movies. These things are not allowed to be told. These expressions of our humanity are completely now out. They're not even on the menu anymore. Do you remember 15 years ago, there's the remake of Battlestar Galactica. That was superb. Great stories, great acting, quite frightening at times. But I think what gave it depth was it had this multi-ethnic, racial, gender, men and women cast. They were all interesting people, and it indulged the dark side, the shadow side of the people. I can remember there was one particular beautiful young fighter pilot, a black girl, she couldn't take anymore, and she commits suicide at one point by blowing her brains out in front of a locker. Well, that came out of nowhere. That's another one you could never have today. The actual thing that this person who's a hero and a combat person just says, "Oh fuck it," and blows their brains out. That would never be allowed today because it's too visceral and it's too real and it's ultimately too human because they don't even want people thinking about their existence in that way.
Yeah, yeah. And well, the other thing is that, I mean, that was a great show. And I think what's happened over, especially in the last few years, that I find with all of these franchises, is that there's not only is there no depth, but there's no joy and there's no hope. Especially in a franchise like Star Trek, which is supposed to be, we're going to put aside all of these modern problems that we have. We're going to make a beautiful world and we're going to go out into space. And yeah, we're going to have problems out there too. But we, at least as a race, as the human race, all of the issues that we had as nations have been resolved. We've got rid of war. We've got rid of violence. We've got rid of crime. We've got rid of disease. It's very utopian, but it was never, and you could say that's unrealistic by itself, sure, but it was aspirational, right? It was never divisive. It never was exclusionary. But now you can see that there's definitely like an agenda there to sort of like kick the white guy, in the straight white man, in the balls. Do you know what I mean? In order to bring up the minority or to bring up the women, right, at the expense of everything else. And it's like, this was never Star Trek. This could never be this way. But this is how it's gone. And, you know, I look at it, what the thing is, you could, doing all of that to Star Trek and Star Wars and Doctor Who and everything else has been one thing. But to do it, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, to Tolkien has been the most egregious thing, because the story of Middle Earth was based upon, you know, Germanic, Norse, Gaelic, Celtic mythology. And yes, mythology is myth, but that mythology is also historical. This is passed down from our ancestors. This is something truly ancient, and therefore it's part of our identity. It is part of our tradition, you know, and because Tolkien was, of all of those franchises, Tolkien wasn't a franchise. To call it a franchise would do it a disservice. It wasn't pop culture. Maybe at the time it might have been considered something akin to that, legacy. But it was literature, exactly.
Yeah,
and that's what I find the hardest to accept, because you could look at Tolkien from whatever spiritual vantage point you come from and feel deeply spiritually moved by it. You know, if you're a pagan, if you're a Christian, if you're a Muslim, whatever, you could feel something, or, you know, or even if you're just somebody who considers himself spiritual, but not associated with any of those faiths. There was something really, I'm trying to use the word, there was a communal aspect to this story.
The archetypes are universal. Yeah. I've even had that watching Bollywood movies. There's like, within India, there is a genre called mythological, where they'll actually make movies of the Hindu, the Vedas and stuff like that. And the exact same emotional transcendentalness is expressed in those films as well. Even though I didn't live in, you know, Kerala in the 5th century, these archetypes are universal. It's the same reason why we watch Bruce Lee films as a kid and they instantly clicked with us. It's the exact same, but what they're creating for this new transhumanist world. These archetypes have no place because they indulge the lower poles of cognition and the spiritual development of people. It's something they just don't want. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. And I think it speaks a great deal to the writers, you know, to the people writing this stuff, that, and this is a critical thing. Tolkien was obviously a very deeply spiritual man. And the fact that there is no attempt made, even superficially, to understand the spiritual themes in Lord of the Rings or even The Hobbit, for example, it's all of it is completely absent. You know, there's a lot of very deeply moving scenes in the Peter Jackson movies, which he captured brilliantly from the books. And one of them is when Pippin is afraid before they are about to go into battle. And he says, you know, I didn't think it was going to end like this, something like this. And Gandalf responds to him that this isn't the end. You know, he says that he talks about the afterlife and he talks about white shores. And, you know, I'm not going to do it justice if I try to quote it, but it's just such an incredibly beautiful scene that I've been moved to tears with with just the actors' performances as well, but how that's directed. This is another thing. There are so many different directors on these 8 episodes. All the TV shows are like this. They do 8 to 10 episodes or so. There's no continuity. There's no consistency in the production anymore. You know, the writers, they have all these different writers, and then one episode to the next, the stories are disjointed. The narrative is a jumbled mess. There's no consistency on which character is going on what journey and why. It has been creatively sacrilegious what they've done.
Yeah, I was just going to say heretical. They did that with the scene where Galadriel is told to go to the Undying Lands from the Grey Havens. Now, in the mythology, the Undying Lands is another dimension. That's the best way to kind of put it. And they showed her going to retirement in a kind of a Disneyland, and then she jumps off and swims. It was, on every level, it was wrong.
So everyone remembers the beautiful scene at the end of The Return of the King, when Frodo and Gandalf and Bilbo they board the ship and they go off to Valinor, to the Undying Lands. And that's, you know, depending on which way you look at it, a lot of people will look at this as the afterlife, or the, you know, this sort of thing, or the next stage of existence, whatever way you want to say it. But either way, it's a deeply moving scene, and it has maybe a sort of for some people a funeral type scene, or whatever you might see it. But anyway, it's definitely sort of the for a Christian, you look at it and you go, that's the afterlife, right? That's heaven that they're going off to. Okay. In the first episode of The Rings of Power, she is given this along with some of the other elves who for hundreds of years have chased Sauron to no success at that point. She's given the opportunity to go out to Valinor, to the Undying Lands, and, you know, sort of retire out there to the great beyond. And so they go on this boat, and they're heading towards the sky parts. There's this great big massive white light, and instead of there being something beautiful and you know, completely overwhelming about this in a good way, instead there's something, even the music and the way it's shot and some of the reactions of the characters, they're uncertain, they're afraid, they're, you know, so this is the thing. It's as though I don't know whether the people who wrote this are like science-loving atheists or something, but I get a strong sense that there's a very secular perspective on this whole on the spiritual. This is the key thing. There's no respect for the transcendent in the Rings of Power at all. And so she's standing there, and it's as though like she's going towards the light, and she's like, oh, I don't want this. Oh, this is creepy. You know,
like she was being like given a clock for her 50 years service before retirement. Like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's like, it's as though she believed there was no fundamental difference between heaven and hell.
Yeah, it's all here. It's all here.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The only thing that matters is the material.
Yeah.
And so she decides, oh, well, I know better than, you know, the spiritual plane, God, gods, whatever you want to say. I know better than all that, right? Because we've got science. So she says, I'm out of here. And they're trying to bring her back. And she's like, oh, no, having none of this. Mm-hmm. So she like grabs a knife and she jumps off. And that, for me, was the moment when I was like, oh boy, like we're dealing with people who fundamentally have no respect, not just for the lore, but for what Tolkien stood for as a man and what he put into this story, you know. Yeah. And that was, yeah.
That's exactly how I felt about it. It was almost like it was a rejection of the divine, and it was laying its cards on the table right in the first episode. We will not indulge transcendental ideas in the show. We will have sort of like a McDonald's philosophy at the very most. Hence the story of the rock and the stone and all that other crap. And the sea is always right. Now, another thing that I think that had a spiritual aspect has been neutered. And you'll get this too, because here in Ireland, we have a very strong sense of the aesthetic of our landscape of the island that we live on. it's not just beautiful. It's a cauldron, a repository of stories. I know the way, even in your political videos, you'll often use beautiful shots of around the countryside in Ireland. So I know you have that same vibe that I do about it. And I think most Irish, well, I don't know about now, but definitely did have about it. It was something that was kind of like, it was a given. It was innate in all of us. And when Peter Jackson, now this is how, how much I was, remember when Peter Jackson's screenshots, rushes were first shown on TV from the Fellowship of the Rings. And I didn't like the look of it initially. And when I heard it was filmed in New Zealand, I was saying, "Oh, it's going to be all wrong. It's going to be all wrong." When you read Tolkien, you are on these islands. You are here. It's the mustiness of the moss and the fungus and the woods, the smell of the earth, the smell of pipe tobacco, in a bog. It's there. I didn't think that New Zealand had it. And to his incredible and immense credit, he made it work. The light is very, very different. And even, actors that were involved in it saying, it's fantastic, but it's not Tolkien's literary Middle Earth, but it still was an amazing vessel that he contained, that he created visually to contain this fantastic movies, this fantastic trilogy. The new one, I don't see. It's almost like they think that Middle Earth looked like New Zealand. You know what I'm saying? Like minus third. It was like they had no concept. They did not go back to this. This is what annoyed me when I was first announced when the show was coming out. I said, "Here's a chance to film it in Britain or Ireland." And ironically, Games of Thrones looked like what Tolkien envisioned Middle Earth to look like, and that's it. Here's a chance for him to make it dark. And what does it look like? It looks like California. And
yeah. I was saying
for the Beach Boys to play as they're going over the CGI shots of the cities.
Yeah, I was saying this in when I was talking about the way the dialogue was written in some scenes, and it was like, well, they probably looked at the films but didn't read the books. so there's sort of inspiration visually, and that is actually true, because I think, yes, they had sort of like consultants, and I know that Simon Tolkien is a consultant on, and that's another can of worms, actually, that one, because I don't think that Simon Tolkien shared the same views that Christopher Tolkien had.
Oh, absolutely. They found a fall guy. They found a soft touch.
Yeah. And so, as I was he, am I wrong in saying he was the executor of the estate, at least at one time? And so, yeah, I think this is the thing. Even Christopher Tolkien, I remember reading, wasn't 100% happy with the films because they were quite action heavy, I suppose. But you could see that both himself and Peter Jackson had at least tried to ensure that they were as close to the books as you could possibly get in live action form. And when you talk about the set design and when you talk about the locations, theoretically, anywhere that's lovely and green, you could have built Hobbiton, you could have built the Shire. It's based on, was it Worcestershire in that was the sort of where
the Midlands Wales border. That's where the Shire was.
That's right, exactly. And he was obviously deeply concerned with industrialization and I can relate to that because I grew up in a very rural part of Dublin, which it's just full of data centers and shitty housing estates now, right? Full of industry. But so I feel that Mordor, from Silicon Valley came to this little part of Dublin, right? But for sure, the landscape is beautiful in New Zealand, it's spectacular, but it isn't really accurate to what they were going for or what Tolkien had envisaged, because I think he tried to learn Irish, and I suspect that he went out to the West in particular. It's not just Ireland, but I think it was very much the west of Ireland. And I would say Connemara, that he was probably in particularly taken by.
He was visiting professor at UCG in Galway, and he was living in the borough in Clare. In fact, that's where he got the idea of the golem from. The golem is a cave demon that lives in the Burren. So Gollum came from this Irish local Clare folklore of a kind of a puka type entity. I also think that the Dead Marshes is probably based on the Irish Midlands, the Bog of Allen, that kind of thing. And Peter Jackson got that spot on in the movie, by the way, when Sam, Frodo, and Gollum, Smeagol were going across the Dead Marshes. I thought that was one of the best scenes in the whole trilogy, the best sections. But this plastic superficialness, and also there's another thing too. I mean, this show bears no respect for the fact that Tolkien created Elvish and other imaginary tongues in Middle Earth. When what we get is kind of California speak. I'm waiting for one of the elves to say "dude" at the end of a sentence or something at this point.
That is actually something that I've remarked on numerous times in Star Trek. Actually, it's especially bad. The language in both Discovery and in Star Trek Picard. Firstly, they're swearing, right? I think Gene Roddenberry be turning his grave. The amount of swearing that's for no good reason, right? And yes, the gratuitous violence and everything else, but the contemporary language, the sort of millennial or Gen Z speak, is so utterly jarring because we've had a canon of decades of Star Trek where they've talked in a particular way, but then apparently when you go into the 25th century, they're talking the way people do in 2022. And yeah.
Another thing that kills me in that is this sort of constant use of insubordination. If you were to try that in the military, it's like some chick will go up to a senior officer and go, "Yeah, whatever. We could try this instead, I guess." That would land you in military prison. The MPs would be on top of you within seconds, and that's even that's being brought into the rings of power as well. Her elves are, like I said earlier on, they're always like they put down a white guy or something, but they're also the butt of these terrible jokes, like the strong woman current thing will often sort of like chastise or demean a man in a way that's like, "Oh, what do you know? You're only a white man." Well, it doesn't say it that way. Now, I hate to even bring that kind of language into it, but they fired the first shots in this war. And I grew up on TV shows that had numerous characters of mine. Blake Seven, even, was like that. It had everything, and so. But I hate to be drawn into this kind of language. They brought me there. They brought us there. We didn't ask. We didn't want this. And when they bring us there, then they accuse anyone who criticizes any aspect of the show as just being hung up on race and stereotypes, and it's a pure bullshit cop out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, on the subject of the insubordination, so there was loads of it in the new one, Star Trek: Strange New Worlds, and there is in Discovery there was one of these characters, again, super snarky, very insubordinate, no respect for authority, and she says, "Get off my ass, sir! Get off my ass, sir!" And it's played for a laugh. And there's a few characters like that. Like on the new show, there's this character called Ortegas, and she says something to the effect of he asks her if he can do something at the helm, and he says, "What's your point, sir?" Like it's like there's no, and this is a key thing. As we know, they want to make the left politically, the Democrats in America, whatever, they want to make young people into revolutionaries, but not because they want them to take down genuine authority. They want to take down conservatives. They want them to take down tradition. They want them to take down the actual, the non-political structure that makes us the way we are, and that made our lives the way identifiable and our world identifiable the way it was.
Yeah, it's the Western version of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That's all it is.
Precisely. And this again is the reason why, and speaking of which, that year zero model of going back to a prequel, just like with Rings of Power, just like with Star Trek, Spock wasn't Spock, really. He didn't become Spock until he met Michael Burnham, who we've retconned in there, Doctor Who didn't really have, his 13, 14 regenerations, because actually he had dozens of regenerations, don't you know? Because it wasn't William Hartnell in 1962 that he started out as. He was actually a little black girl originally. I'm not making that up. They actually, Chris Chibnall rewrote the look, and this is actually something, because I wanted to talk about Sauron and the nature of evil if we had the chance, but this was very similar with Doctor Who. They go back and they create an entirely new origin story to say, well, it's okay now that we can change things in the future, because don't you know, actually in the past it was completely different. And so this constant subversion, not just of your expectations, but of history, the constant rewriting. And that is the Orwellian thing you mentioned. He who controls the past controls the future.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it in archaeology. Apparently Newgrange and Stonehenge were built by Neolithic farmers who looked like Lenny Henry. That we're told they're dark skinned. Now, why do they say they're dark skinned? Now, I have no problem if they wear dark skin and they look like that. Doesn't bother me one bit. But the lies and deception is what bothers me. The fact is that they come from Anatolia, which is in modern day Turkey. Have you ever seen an Anatolian? They're about as dark as a light skinned Italian. But because people are stupid and uneducated and ignorant today, they think someone from Anatolia in Turkey must be really, really dark and look like, say, someone from the Arabian Peninsula or Pakistan, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or Kerala. And that's how they look. And it's a gross distortion. Yes, they were darker skinned, but they would have looked like the Turks today, or the Greeks or Macedonians. And this goes on and on. And again, I have no problem with it. I would have no problem with Lenny Henry playing that character. It doesn't bother me. I'm not really. It's just stupidity of mixing it all up. And there's lots of darker races. This is another thing too. There's an inherent racism in what these people do. If they really wanted to bring minorities into that story, Tolkien mentioned and wrote of certain races in the south of Middle-earth who had grievances with Gondors. There was a chance to bring in people of color and give them their own characters, actors, storylines. And rather than saying, oh, you're now good enough to be a Harfoot. I see that. Do you notice that? It's like, you're now good enough to be this. And then they give them an Irish. The same people who get them speaking these like stage Irish accents are the first ones to talk about cultural appropriation.
Yeah. I think this is the thing that it's a difficult one, really, but I do think it comes down to where they want demographics to go in the West in general. It's part of the social engineering aspect, because it's exactly as I say about. There's actually an example of this that I could read to you right now. It was an article from 2016 from the BBC, and it says Doctor Who role was offered to black actor, says Stephen Moffat, which I don't have any major issue there at all, as long as the actor is good enough. But he talks about how Doctor Who can obviously do period drama, because they can go back to, say, Regency London, for example. And he proceeds to talk about how, when he says, Moffat said that the show must find new ways to get ethnic minority actors on screen in future. And he says, we've kind of got to tell a lie. We'll go back into history and there will be black people where historically there wouldn't have been, and we won't dwell on that. We'll say, to hell with it. It's the imaginary better version of the world. By believing in it, we will summon it forth. Now, I don't have any issue with Doctor Who having these minority characters either.
For artistic sake is
right
different than social engineering.
Exactly. But if you're going to start lying to people about history, we're going to tell a lie. And they've been doing this, and they've been doing this history. But I know we're sort of pressed for time. I did want to, just on the Doctor Who point, going back and retelling his history is actually it was a critical bugbear there for a lot of long-term Doctor Who fans, a lot of Whovians, because the whole basis of what made that character Doctor Who so compelling in whatever iteration he was the fact that you didn't know why he was on the run from the Time Lords, and his past was a mystery. And mystery is, they want to unpack everything, right? They always want to deconstruct everything, as you know, Thomas. because they're deconstructionists and they want to break everything apart and they can't put it back together in an interesting manner. So they just destroy, right? And so they come up with this really awful backstory for Doctor Who. And this reminded me of what they've been doing with this season on the Rings of Power with Sauron. Because for me, what was wonderful about how Peter Jackson depicted Sauron in the films was that he was incorporeal for the most part. And an incorporeal evil, I think, is more terrifying.
Yeah.
Because it's not, I'm not saying that there's hard, fantastic villains out there who are obviously anthropomorphic villains, but the only times when he's actually in a sort of a physical form is when he's in his suit of armor, he's got his helmet on and everything. But that's obviously inside, underneath that, you get the sense that he was something incorporeal like a ring wraith, right? He was energy. And for the most part, he is this all-seeing eye. And what's wonderful, because what I think about depicting evil this way is it makes it feel much more sinister, because I can't see the individual's eyes. I can't see, they're not a human villain, right?
I remember when I first read about Melkor in the first age, and he was basically an energy form that was composed of a type of music that was played differently. And that was the mind, that's it, the incorporeal evil of Lovecraft and these kinds of things is much more terrifying.
Yeah, it's leaving it up to the imagination, and the imagination inside the human person can make things 10 times more terrifying. Because I think if you can't see your enemy, there's something deeply primal in that. That's the fight or flight response, right? When you're in a forest and it's late at night and it's very dark and you can't see, and you hear the rustle in the grass or you hear a twig snap, right? And you're on alert. You cannot see your enemy. You don't know. And of course, that's not necessarily evil, but it is a threat. And evil is a threat. And so the imagination is just gone, right? They're trying to give us absolutely everything. And it's ruining suspense. It's ruining anticipation. And instead, we have this sort of standard bloke, and he's supposed to be Sauron, and I'm supposed to sort of accept that, Sauron's just a guy. He's just a guy, you know?
Same the horror genre. I mean, like the Blair Witch Project, we saw nothing. But that's what made it so fantastic. You saw nothing. Yeah. And they replaced that suspense and mystery with gore in the horror genre, I've noticed. I want to talk about another thing. Did you ever watch Blake 7? Have you ever gone to Blake 7?
I've seen one or two.
Well, I'm older than you, so I was in school, and that was in the day. But do you know, I don't know if you know this or the viewers know this, how Blake ended up on the run from the Federation was he was falsely accused of being a pedophile. Now, that was on a primetime TV show back in the early 80s. Yeah, he was falsely accused of being a pedophile, and he basically had to go on the run with these bandits to kind of like overthrow the Federation. There's now feelers being sent out there about a possible remake of Blake 7. Will it be that rewritten or reframed that he was in a love affair with a very young man, and it was forbidden, and this love is love, and he's running away because the Federation are all evil bigots who don't understand that all love is love? And I'm like, I'm afraid, I'm sorry I even said this live on the air, because I could see someone at the BBC going, he just gave us the storyline.
or worse, he was he could be like, why are you on the run? I didn't subscribe to the gender binary, right? It could be something as inane as like he was just a non-binary, he was just pan-romantic or something.
Oh yeah, so I'm sorry if Blake 7's fan if I ruined their show with that one. It's coming anyway. It's coming anyway. Returning to the Rings of Power, is the show, or does the show have any redeemable aspects that they could actually fix in future seasons? Because it sounds like that, what you call it, it's Amazon are determined to destroy themselves to finish this thing off.
Well, I'm actually worried a little bit about this show more than a lot of other series that will end up getting cancelled because they're terrible. Or at least, the US box office will, the court of public opinion can ruin a movie if it's bad. But I don't know if it's going to be too easy to learn an awful lot of lessons about Rings of Power and the audience response, because one assumes that Amazon with their, I mean, it's $1 billion show, literally. They had to spend an enormous amount of money to get the rights to this. And something a critical drinker had said, they did not earn the right. They bought the right? And this is why it's so important to get Tolkien correct. But I do worry, Thomas, because every time you buy something on Amazon, you're probably keeping that show going, right? This is the thing, right? So theoretically, yes, it's possible maybe to redeem this series, but they would have to either completely rewrite Galadriel or let her go off to Valinor for feck's sake, right? She's not going to, because we know that this is a prequel, so she has to be in the Third Age. But yeah, I find it especially difficult with this show because the protagonist is so unlikable.
Totally.
Right. And no disrespect to the actress, I think she's miscast. I don't think she has the gravitas or
she belongs with Friends. She belongs with Friends in that apartment in New York. She doesn't belong in Middle Earth.
Yeah, as one of Joey's girlfriends who was a guest star for an episode, yeah. Right? Not a main character. And this is the thing. So as for the rest of it, look, if you watched it with the sound off, okay, some of the costumes aren't great, like people have talked about some of the costumes not being amazing, but some of it's very good. Visually, stylistically, it looks on point. And we talked about the scenery being beautiful. And some of the CG, slightly TV budget, but most of it's very good and on point. Some of the fight scenes, her fight scenes not so good, but some of the big battles have been fine. It's inconsistent, and it really needs, I think, and I know it's sort of controversial in other ways, it needs like a Joss Whedon type showrunner. It needs somebody, or a Kevin Feige, it needs somebody like that who will just sort of run the show and have map out a complete story arc for the entire season and know where every character is going to go and why they're there. It feels like there's a lot of characters who are just there because they needed to fill up runtime. Like a few of the episodes are longer than others, and you can see the walking around, the reaction shots. It's purely in there, the pacing, because the episodes are too long. They got to reach the runtime. So they've a lot of issues to work out, and I think the damage is done. I don't think an awful lot of people are going to want to watch.
I'm going to try and experiment soon. I'm going to get a couple of episodes. Do you know that famous urban legend? I don't know if you heard it, that if you turn down the sound on The Wizard of Oz and play The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, that it matches perfectly the film. I'm just trying to think what, and I've been going through albums in my head. I was thinking of dark black metal or Burzum or something like that. It's probably only working like a Justin Bieber. It's like, I mean, it's like it will in the future, like 50 years from now, the kids will be going, if you play Taylor Swift's album over the first episode of Rings of Power, man, it just fucking fits perfectly. It's weird. weird.
We'll have to give it a go.
Yeah. But yeah, I'd say it's kind of, I often have this conversation with people my age and younger ones like yourself, and older ones like John Waters, sorry, John, that we feel very privileged to have grown up when we did. I can remember as a kid going to the Wynn's Newsagent every Saturday in Ballymun Shopping Centre when I was 9 or 10, and they used to get Marvel Comics, DC and Marvel Comics, delivered in odd batches because it wasn't like we didn't get them week after week in Ireland back in then. They just came when they arrived. And so you'd get like 3 or 4 Supermans or 3 or 4 Spider-Mans together. And at a very early age, the lessons I learned was that the characters in Marvel comics were much more rounded, intelligent, and real life. Where the ones in DC comics were all American heroes, with the exception of Batman. They were all American heroes. And I never needed anyone to teach me that as a kid, that there was something deeper to Peter Parker's awkwardness around girls. It was almost, looking back on it now, it was a great life lesson almost, that here you was, and this kind of thing that you have from them. Again, I think that those they were, and Thor and everything, Stan Lee and Kirby, that stuff was rooted in mythology anyway, so much of it. Again, they don't have teachers. Our teachers, you could show, there's the Joseph Campbells. I think it's up to people like myself and yourself and people like us to do everything we can to continue this legacy of art having a spiritual depth and meaning and pathos and transcendence and so on. So how would we do that in the few minutes we have left, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I did talk about this before at the end of last year. I started talking about films. Like I looked at there's actually a very good Jim Carrey movie called The Majestic, which is actually, it's quite refreshing to see him in a serious role. But it's a beautiful movie actually. It's not from that long ago. I think it's like from like the early 2000s or something. And I talked about the film Casablanca, and so some classic movies. And I proceeded to do reviews of some, so retro reviews of old classic movies, and what they were saying at the time. And I like to do that from time to time. And at the same point, I don't do enough of it. But I also look at it another way and I go, am I falling into a trap of focusing on, it was like you talked about this as well, and I talked about it during the lockdowns. um I think it was in the second lockdown, or maybe towards the end of the first one. um Things were very bad, and you talked about how when I don't know who you're referring to, but when someone would listen to a song or they'd see a movie, that everything was a reminder of better times, because
Yeah.
everything was better times before what we were living through. And I think sometimes we can forget just how bad it was, that we thought, are we ever going to get out of this? Like, there was a part of it, it was like, is this it? Are we living in a prison life where everything's closed and everything's shut off, and I'm just sitting there watching YouTube on my television, looking at old music videos and listening to songs from the 80s and 90s, and remembering like what life was like, because all of those things culturally were a reminder of just how good we had it forever, right? And now here we are. And so there's a part of me that does want to say, to younger people, look, there are so many great movies that you've probably never seen, that even from an education perspective would be wonderful for you to learn so much about life and so much about art and so the stories of the time. And yet we do really need to make new stories. We need to make new ones, because somebody needs to write albums and films about what we're going through right now, and stories about the lockdown or whatever. We need to start doing these things, because, and that's why I made a video recently about something that isn't totally organic from the internet, which was the back rooms, which a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know about. But it came from an internet meme. I made a video about it. I won't get into a long explanation, but suffice to say, it turned into a genre of short filmmaking. And it's mostly horror based, so maybe that's not necessarily everybody's bag, but it was just so utterly original. And I just thought, there's so many of these videos and these filmmakers now on YouTube who have this platform, and they can get their content out there. And some of them, there's a guy called Kane Pixels, very, very talented artist. The guy's only 17 years old. He's making these very sophisticated films with CG, and it's wonderful. And I'm like, some of these have millions and millions of views, more views than the ratings of most TV shows nowadays. So you don't even need Hollywood. So theoretically, new industries should form. Hopefully, if we have a free market of ideas in the future, people can, and if the means are there, I don't see any reason why we need to, because we can't live in this stage where we're always looking back, because we're living at the end of history. We're not. There was no, what you talked about, when you were young, and what you were watching and reading. And I remember in the late 80s and the early 90s, my uncle used to get VHS tapes sent. So it was pre-internet, VHS tapes sent from America, from a friend of his, of the latest Babylon 5 and Star Trek episodes. And we were able to watch them ahead of where they were in the UK. And so I can remember all of that. I can remember the excitement of new material, of new content. And I haven't had that buzz in a long time. And I just don't want to see more prequels. I don't want to see more bastardized reboots and remakes that are going to be woke and deliberately designed to demoralize. I want to see people produce something that's completely apolitical and completely new and fresh. It is possible, but I think we're still looking too much at the Hollywood machine, maybe both now and in the past, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense, and I totally agree with this concept that we shouldn't be shy away from their high-end technology, and actually we should try and co-opt it for ourselves. we should be like Prometheus and steal the fire from the gods. And even like if you look what Joseph Campbell said about the problem with modern man is he can't invent a mythology to keep up with his industrialization. There's a lot of truth to that, but now it's actually we can't even keep up we can't even invent new cultures to keep up with the changes going on. But I'm actually positive about the future, that we'll have like what we had in music in the 1970s with the punk rock thing. We'll have a back to basics thing, like I think we were just talking about. That's a classic example of it, where we'll have sort of like a garage filmmaking and garage storytelling and garage mythology that it always comes up from the bottom, and it definitely will. I think there's the lack of spiritual gravitas in all these reboots and these remakes and all this stuff. It's ultimately the seeds of their own destruction, because it already is pedestrian and boring, and people just won't put up with it. They want something new, like you said. That is fantastic, Brett. That's fantastic, Dave, and thanks for coming on.
Pleasure.
You got Computing Forever on YouTube. You're on Odyssey with Dave Cullen and Computing Forever. What else do you have of people?
Well, yeah, well, Computing Forever is not there now on YouTube, but it hasn't been there for a while. But you can certainly watch the Dave Cullen show on YouTube, and then on Odyssey and BitChute. That's all the political stuff, if you want to see that as well. I'm just churning out the content as much as I can, and it's been I've really enjoyed getting back into the pop culture commentary more than anything, because it's, like I say, it's a refreshing break from the heaviness of what we've gone through and what we might still have to endure for a little longer.
Yeah, you should start writing scripts yourself. Serious, I think it'd be quite.
It's crossed my mind. I would like to start. I'd like to think there's a book in me, so I might give it a go at some point. But if I can find the time,
even get mythology before Hollywood discovers Irish mythology, before Hollywood gets its hand on it. And Cullen is I don't know, a cross-dresser with cerebral palsy or something. I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
Dave Cullen from Computer Forever. Thanks for everything you do. You're an absolute fucking legend, man. And
you too, Thomas.
This is a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.